Cafe Scientifique on this beautiful sunny evening. Of course, there are some new faces in the audience, as this Cafe Scientifique is part of Bournemouth University's Festival of Learning. I know some of the people here in the room today have already been enjoying some events, but if you haven't heard of it or you don't already know about it, come and talk to me and I'll tell you all about it. Before we kick off our talk this evening, just a few of the usual housekeeping rules and information. For those of you that are unfamiliar with the format of Cafe Scientifique, we will have a short talk this evening, followed by an interlude long enough, hopefully, to refill your glasses, maybe get another bite to eat, and then we'll all reconvene for some questions, answers, general discussion. Please do go and grab yourselves a drink or a snack at any time over the proceedings of this evening. These guys really kindly host us every month, so it's fantastic to support them. We will be taking some pictures this evening, which we'll probably use for future kind of marketing purposes, promotion of Cafe Scientifique. If you don't want to appear in any pictures, just let me know and we'll make sure that you don't. If you want to use social media, we confusingly have two hashtags that you can use for Twitter. Hashtag BUFest13 and also our usual CAFSI Boscanova. We've also got a Festival of Learning Facebook page. There is a rather dodgy picture stuck up on the side of the bar with the more details if you want to use that. As usual, Liz downstairs, fire exits behind you. So it is then with enormous pleasure, and I've got to know Holger over the last year or so that I've been working at BU. Holger is Deputy Dean of the School of Applied Sciences and Professor of Bioarchaeology. Before coming to Bournemouth University, he worked at Gothenburg, Copenhagen and Bradford. His research applies scientific methods to the reconstruction of life and living conditions in past communities from human skeletal remains. And this combines the biology of people with the social, cultural, political and economic context that they lived in. I'm fascinated. I don't know how you can tell all these things from skeletons, but I'm sure we're about to find out. And then in one particular aspect of his research, because I know that he has very, very broad interests, is all about food and diet. And basically sort of eating habits and the choice of foodstuffs, what they tell us about ourselves. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce, so do you think you are what you eat? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Becca, for a very kind introduction. I'm glad to see so many of you here. And you may not know, but it's Healthy Eating Week. That coincides with a still unpublished survey by the British Nutrition Foundation with some interesting results. Asking some 70 to 27,000 school children, a staggering 29 of them think that cheese is made from plants. 34 think that pasta is a meat product. And they even think that bread is made from meat. And that fish fingers are made of chicken or pork. So are you all sure what you're eating? Well, let's see. Just to give you a quick idea of what eating is about. We all need to have our daily intake of what we call macronutrients. So proteins, carbohydrates, fat, some minerals and vitamins. And we need that to actually keep going. So that is food by necessity. Nutrition is the sort of more intricate things of actually the nutritional value, the content of those macro components of our food. And that is depending on what you can get. But the whole story lies in what actually we make of it, the diet. And diet is very much about what we can get hold of and what we choose. So diet actually is, whether we like it or not, and you will find out in the course of the next minute or so, something that is much more to do with how we perceive ourselves and how we express ourselves through the stuff we eat every day. And I give you an example. In terms of nutritional value, there is almost no difference between lobster and cod. what a difference it is in terms of statement. Whether you can afford lobster every day if you so wish. I don't particularly like it. Okay. Or if you have your fish and chips every day. You know, apart from the batter and all the fat, but you know, if you just take if you just take the fish, that's actually, in terms of protein content, no difference. But it certainly is a difference whether or not you are able to afford it. So, diet, in a way, is behavior, because it has to do with choice and with things that we can actually decide whether or not we want it. Okay? And that, of course, is nothing new. People in the past have started to think about that for a long time. And this gentleman here, Jean-Antoine Savarin, was one of the first people who actually started to think scientifically about food. And he came up with this very well-known adage, which translates into, tell me what you eat and I will tell you who you are, or what you are. And in a similar vein, the German philosopher Ludwig Andreas Feuerbach created this pun that really only works in German, der Mensch ist, was er isst, which is basically you are what you eat. So the question is that really true? Or were these people just picking something up and putting it into nice aphorisms? So let's start with something very broad. We all know the foodstuffs of other countries, do we? So where's that from? And this? And this? And this? And this? Okay, well that may be true, and you know, we perceive these to be very typical dishes of countries, but of course we all know, if you know, nobody would like British food to be confined to fish and chips. And that is true for all the other countries. But this is part of our notion of, you know, what eating habits we find in countries around ourselves. And of course, there is much more to it, because there are national cuisines. And that brings us closer to the actual matter. It is almost unthinkable, even for the most modest of households in France, to have a meal that doesn't consist of 3 courses. That's just the standard. Or, could you imagine Thanksgiving Day in America without a turkey? Just imagine pork sausages. It doesn't really work. Okay? So there are certain elements that are very, very deeply ingrained in the culture. And diet is very much part of the cultural kit of communities. So, in a way, humans have the ability to transform food, the things we eat every day, into some kind of meaning. And by doing that, they, whether they want or not, create some kind of self-expression. And if you like, you can say humans create diet, which is cultured biology. And let's explore that a little bit further. There is a wonderful story that was carried out in the early 80s, somewhere in America, where people tried to, they asked people how they perceived their own eating habits and how that correlates with their beliefs. And then they tested that and told other people the beliefs, and they were asked to put that into eating categories. And it works both ways. So here you go. It may not be quite the same today, but in the early 80s of the US, that was the case. When you were a vegetarian, you were considered to be non-competitive, a moderate drug user, serious, sexual, pacifist, and so on. If you were a fast food devotee, you were considered to be religious, logical, conservative, wearing polyester shirts, competitive, business suit wearing, family orientated, and the like. And if you were a gourmet, of course, you were a serious drug user. And you lived alone, which was something in America at the time. You were liberal, you were an atheist, you were cultured, sensual, self-orientated, and sophisticated. Anyone recognize them? Yeah? Okay, so there may be, because the interesting thing about that study really was that it was mutually recognizable. So you tell people what they eat and they tell you who they are. And you tell people who they are and you will be told what they eat. Isn't that fascinating? Okay, so there is something deeper in that. That somehow cultural beliefs and attitudes go with food preferences. And the question is whether we find that on a larger scale. Now this necessitates almost a little excursion into some theory. There is this wonderful and classic anthropologist called Claude Lévi-Strauss. And he worked a lot in Brazil and elsewhere in South America. And he was basically the founder of a tradition that's called structuralism. And these people try to find out the basic, fundamental, underlying principles of how people organize their lives and structure their lives around them. And if you apply that to food, he thought there must be very basic components and very basic principles that people use to categorize food in their natural environment. So basically he came up with properties of food, if you like. You have raw food, you have rotted food, and you have cooked food in the sense of done. Okay? And that creates an interesting distinction because you divide between something that is natural, you can have raw food and rotted food without doing anything, and a cultural realm where you have cooked food. Okay? And you have something that occurs under normal circumstances and something that only occurs in a transformed state. Something happens to the food. If we translate that into a more scientific view, we could probably say that these categories of raw and rotted and cooked would now be raw fermented, like cheese, milk. See, it's off, but it's natural. And it has to do with microbiology. And this has to do with temperature. Okay? So if you apply basic chemical or physical principles, you are suddenly arriving at slight variations of naturally occurring foodstuffs. Okay? So these are very, very fundamental principles of how people perceive food and diet in the natural environment. Now keep in mind that we are looking at a kind of triangle here, and I will introduce you to an example which exemplifies this principle here. Whatever we eat, we only eat it because we actually also think it's good to think. Otherwise we wouldn't eat it. Have you ever tried to eat something that's blue?
Blue Smartie?
That's not blue inside. It's very easy. Try to make sponge cake and color it blue. It's very difficult to eat. Okay? No, it's not. Okay. No, but there's a deeper meaning to it, and I will tell you a little story about the Maasai in Kenya or elsewhere in Eastern Africa, because they are. Again, this is an example of ideal food categories, and it probably doesn't work like that in real life, but it exemplifies the idea behind it, the idea behind pure foodstuffs. Okay? So, you have different layers of complexity. You have food, you have the condition of the food, you have a certain social group, you have a location where that social group is supposed to be most of the time, and you have something that has to do with food production. Okay? And if you look at the warrior caste, which is indeed basically the young men who need to go through initiation rituals, they're supposed to be hunting, live in the bush, eat raw foodstuffs, which is mostly blood, because they're bleeding their animals. Okay? These are pastoral nomads. They have large herds of cattle. And they don't kill them for meat, but they bleed them. Blood is pretty nutritious, okay? So, other groups, like women for example, do most of the farming when climatic conditions allow it. So they stay in the settlement, they eat cooked foodstuffs, and that would be mostly milk in some kind of processed form. And the third group, the elders, would care for the herds, eat fried meat. Now, nobody can tell me that this is exclusive, But the three food categories of meat, milk and blood are thought to be God-given, divine categories of food. So they have some innate purity to them that is basically commanding. And even though, in daily life that doesn't really work all the time, that is the idea. And therefore you have these basic principles of food items that you internalize, that have to be good to think, to be able to be lived as well. Now you think East Africa is very exotic? Join me and go to France. In a fairly recent study, it was actually found that in traditional Breton fishing communities, there is some archaic stuff going on. Men are supposed to be really tough guys and live on red wine, strong cigarettes, and meat. And women, of course, are supposed to be weaker, and they drink coffee and milk, lots of milk, white stuff, and eat tarts and cakes. Now again, this doesn't really work, but it is part of a deeply ingrained concept of how society works and how the division within society translates into certain eating habits. So how diet basically is derived from an understanding of how your own society works. And that's just round the corner. And I'm sure if somebody wanted to go into the British countryside, they would find probably something interesting. I haven't done that, but I would love to, because I'm sure we can find something. So, that's one aspect. But diet is also about invention and cultural transmission. If you live in the tropics and you have lots of roots and tubers that you could dig out and eat, you may come across one that is actually very unpalatable because it's highly toxic. It's called manioc. Okay? So you really don't want to eat it because you die instantly. Whoever tried that once didn't try it again. But in large parts of South America, manioc is a staple. So people dig it out and process it. And this is actually quite an intricate process. So diet is about invention. And if you start to prepare manioc, what you need to do after planting, of course, is you peel and grate it, and then you rinse out the cyanic acid. Very, very strong toxic chemical. Then you press it, you toast it, and in the end you have something that's called farinha, which is manioc flour. And that allows you to make whatever you want with it. But essentially, the inventiveness and the necessity to make use of the existing resources around you allow people to even exploit something that under normal circumstances nobody would touch. And also, manioc in its raw form, because it has cyanic acid in it, has a very irritating taste, if you can imagine. So you wouldn't really want to do that. Which brings me to something, there are innate avoidances of taste. Normally we don't eat bitter things, but we drink bitter, don't we? We eat Brussels sprouts, yes, and we eat other bitter things. So because it's an acquired taste. So there are other acquired tastes. For example, why do people love to eat chili peppers? We shouldn't be doing that. It's revolting. Because in evolutionary terms, we don't eat things that have irritating taste because we just sense that they're not good for us. But at the same time, even though we don't know that initially, all the very spicy things have antimicrobial properties. And this is why they are so popular in hot countries. And if you find the right combination, for example, things like Italian spice mixture or herbs of the Provence, for example, that actually kills up to 75% of all, unwanted gut bacteria. So that's a pretty good thing to have. Now, but still, if you eat chili peppers and are not used to that, why would you do that? It has been suggested that eating chili peppers creates a reaction that is very similar to natural release of opiates after something that is extremely painful. And also, once you start to experience that, it gives you a kick, this anticipation of thrill. So you may want to do that again. Okay? So, in this transmission chain of some biological property, a daring individual, and then some kind of acceptance within the community, and then the perpetuation of that with other people trying it out, creates something that eventually chili pepper are being incorporated into the cuisine as a taste principle, and then people get used to that, and they like it, and then because it will be reinforced within the society, it suddenly becomes part of what people do every day. Okay, so it's invention and cultural transmission, both of these aspects. Now, what and how much of that can we find out in past populations? And finally, I'm coming to the point that you were mentioning, but I only really wanted to touch on that in a very small way, because it's a bit complicated, but I try to make that as easy as possible. So, how on earth do we get dietary information into the skeleton? Well, essentially, we have sort of sediments and rocks and all sorts of things that consist of chemical elements. They're just everywhere around us. And if we start to till the land, and if we use the natural soils, they also have a chemical signature that is very characteristic. And that chemical signature goes into our foodstuffs, and by ingesting the food and storing all the good stuff, like the minerals, for example, that go into the bone, or other chemical elements that go into other parts of the skeleton, we can simply measure those and then find out something about what these people were eating in the past by looking at the chemical composition of their skeletons. And the way we need to interpret that is to put that within the wider context of what we call a food chain. Basically, this principle of eat and being eaten. So if you have some herbivores like cows or sheep or goats, and you have pigs and humans as omnivorous creatures, and you have carnivores here, that is how you then suddenly get an idea of where you can place the dietary signal that comes out of the chemical elements of the skeleton on that scale. And back to our question, whether we are what we eat, sometimes you want to know whether people actually made that differentiation in the past as well, depending on social standing, on status, on availability, on their ability to access foodstuffs of different quality. And this is just one example of Iron Age communities about 2,500 years ago in Bohemia, of all places. And if you look at this plot here, basically what this tells you, this is a ratio of nitrogen in the skeleton, and the higher the number here, the higher the amount of animal protein. And lo and behold, what you find is, in that society, there is a differentiation between males that were buried with weaponry, maybe and possibly as a signifier of some kind of property they displayed during life, warriors, that's what archaeologists like to suggest, and those that haven't had these items in their graves. And what we find is that those with all these weaponry in their graves had, on average, more animal protein during life, and that is reflected in their skeletons. Okay, so that is a very, very basic principle of how we can try to get this kind of sophistication reflected even in skeletal populations. Maybe not to the same amount of detail as we are able to detect that in living populations, but we're getting there. Okay? And one final example is from these guys. Now they are very interesting because essentially they're like polar bears. Why are they like polar bears? They are what we call top predators. And I will show you why. These are 4 different Neanderthals in a study from my colleague Hervé Bosch. And basically all these plots down here are animals. Herbivores like, bison, deer, reindeer, horse, rhinoceros, mammoth, all sorts of things. And up here you have really sort of carnivorous guys like hyenas, wolves and cave lions. But they're all topped by Neanderthals. So Neanderthals basically were at the very, very top of the food chain. They largely ate large mammals. They did also pick the odd berry and nut and maybe wild grasses or so, but not to a significant effect that it would have shown in the bone chemistry of their skeletons. Okay? So very interesting stuff. Now, don't suggest that this is why they died out. They certainly had a very, very different diet from the anatomically modern people that followed them, because they were much more varied and variable in their diet. So this is what we can do with our old skeletons. And to wrap it up, so what we've seen here basically is that diet comes in various guises and it has served a lot of different purposes. Well, one of the most important things is that diet almost always serves a social purpose. One of it, for example, is that we are here tonight. You know, you have all had a wonderful meal and you hear something about diet. And people have heard about that and known about that. This is a business meeting taking place in the late 16th century. This is a dinner of a butcher's guild. Okay? They just probably celebrate a good financial year or good economic year or whatever. Not uncommon, you know that. Business dinners are very common because it's so easy and much more relaxed to talk about business over food, okay, over dinner. This is probably the most iconic of dinners we've ever come across. Sometimes people use the depiction of dinner to say, you shouldn't. This is a wonderful painting by Jacob Jordaens. It's called the King is Drinking. And this is, and you can see the king here. This is on the occasion of Epiphany, where people used to dress up and choose a king from, out of their middle, and then they got horribly drunk. And they vomited and did all sorts of things. And basically, this is a sort of moralistic painting. You shouldn't do that. But what I find interesting and fascinating about this painting is, look here. I don't know. This is not eaten in this country, but in the Netherlands, people eat raw herring, which is slightly fermented, and it's a delicacy. You must try it. This is how you eat it, actually, and this is one of the rare occurrences where people have depicted that. And finally, this has become a mainstay. Okay, we find that all over the world, and this is, maybe one of the really potent cultural heritages, if you like, of diet. Drink is a diet as well, and this has become universal. And with that, thank you very much for your attention, and enjoy whatever you have been eating.